Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to bring you my October wrap up. I've got quite a few books, 10, 11 that I finished in October, which is awesome because that's a pretty good reading month for me. But I did read some like small short stories, short audiobooks as well. So without further ado, let's just get into this. Okay, so one book that I do need to bring up that I forgot to put in my September wrap-up, I'm gonna throw into this wrap-up, just so I can like document that I actually read this thing. So, the book that I read back in September that I'm throwing in my October wrap-up is The Book Thief by Marcus Cusack. I've been wanting to read this book forever. It has been on my TBR forever, years and years and years. I finally found an Audible edition for pretty cheap, so I decided to listen to it on audiobook. Little did I know that there was actual like pictures and stuff in this novel, which I kind of wish I had known beforehand before I just started listening to the audiobook. I think maybe I would have enjoyed the story a little bit more. I'm rating it PG-13 due to a lot of like German repetitive like bad language, just not like American bad language, but in German language, it's you know, like bitch and slut and all that kind of stuff, and it was repetitive. And then, of course, just the violence behind this. So if you are unaware of what The Book Thief is, it is told from the perspective of death, which I know sounds weird. It was really hard to comprehend, but just go with it. It works. It was pretty cool. But the majority of this story is about Liesel, who is a young German girl who, of course, is obsessed with books. During World War II, the Germans liked to burn books. You gotta love Hitler in those days. So she would actually steal books, and that's why it's called The Book Thief. Her way of just reading books and storytelling pretty much kind of kept her family alive and living. They'd had something to live for while they also housed a Jewish man in their house and were trying to keep it under wraps. It was a great book. I love anything to do with World War II, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Marcus Cusack, you did an amazing job. I just think I would have liked this book a little bit more if maybe I had read it and not done the audiobook, because there are a lot of drawings and stuff that Liesel does in here, along with the Jewish man. That's what he's like. And so, I don't know. I liked it. It didn't like floor me, but at the same time, wasn't bad. 3 stars. The next book that I finished in actually October. So I'm gonna go in order of how I finished them through October. I have been trying to chuck through the 7 books of Narnia. So the Chronicles of Narnia, there's 7 books. I started it back at the end of August when it was Booktubeathon. I read quite a few, and then I read a few more in September, but I had one last book that I needed to finish, and I wasn't able to finish it until the very beginning of October, and that is The Last Battle. Now, I loved this whole bind-up of all 7 because it included them how they should have been written chronologically. If you're unaware, C.S. Lewis wrote all 7 of these, but he wrote them in different orders. But then, like the way the publishing date was, isn't exactly how they should have been chronologically. So the very first book, of course, in the Chronicles of Narnia is The Magician's Nephew. And then the second one is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it goes on from there. So this is not set up from publication dates. This is actually set up how they chronologically should have been. I loved that aspect of it. The Last Battle is probably my least favorite out of all of the Chronicles of Narnia. I gave it a 2 star, but it was just a little bit lackluster. So I didn't have any empathy or attachment to any of the characters. The battle was just like meh. You did get to see some of the other original Narnia characters come back in this Last Battle, but at the same time, it was such a short book that I think if C.S. Lewis actually took the time and put more effort into the story, made it a little bit longer, I think The Last Battle could have been 10 times better than it was, but it just kind of was meh. I rated it G because it's definitely like a middle grade book. unless you consider ass a bad word, but the only way it was referred to in here was actually a donkey, so it's still a rated G for me. I'm super bummed that the last battle probably wasn't my favorite, but I am so glad that I was able to finish all 7 of these. I mean, this chunker, there's like over 1,000 pages. Anyways, I'm just glad I finished it. It's great. The next book that I picked up in the month of October, and from here on out, all through October, I did spooky thriller books, like nonstop, and it was such a blast to read in the month of October. I loved it. I read The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kiersten White. This is my first Kiersten White book ever, but I need to kind of tell you a little bit. When I first finished this book, I only rated it a 4-star. I loved it. It was great. But I was like, yeah, I kind of was missing something. I couldn't figure it out. Lo and behold, after I read this, I decided to pick up Mary Shelley's original Frankenstein. And oh my God, that made a huge difference for this book. So if you have never read Mary Shelley Frankenstein, I highly recommend that you read it either before or after this book, and it'll make a bigger impact on this book. I hope that makes sense. So I think because I read this first, and then a week later I read Mary Shelley Frankenstein, all of a sudden Elizabeth's character made so much more sense to me because I read Frankenstein, the original one. So in Frankenstein, Elizabeth is mentioned, but she's not mentioned a ton. She's a very small side character. In this book, it pretty much follows exactly how Mary Shelley Frankenstein's book is, but instead of from Victor's point of view, you're getting Elizabeth's point of view. Elizabeth Frankenstein grows up in a household that is just really harsh and poor, and Victor's parents decide to adopt her and pretty much give her a place to live and amazing clothes and food on the table for her as long as she just befriends Victor. Victor is a little bit different, even as a child, and he has a really hard time acclimating to just society and other people. So they think Elizabeth is gonna be his playmate and gonna be his friend. So Elizabeth and Victor Frankenstein grow up together, and they have a very close relationship. She has this feeling of needing to take care of him. She knows that pretty much her job is to keep him in line and keep him sane in front of everyone else, or else the Frankensteins are gonna get rid of her, and she can't afford to go anywhere else, and mold herself into exactly what Victor wants. But of course, there's repercussions along the way, and she starts to figure out that Victor is a little bit different in more ways than one. So I rated this now a 5-star after reading the original Mary Shelley Frankenstein. I originally gave it a 4. I bumped it up to a 5 because just reading the original Frankenstein changed my mind about this and made so much more of an impact on me than I thought it would do. Rated at PG-13. It does have violence, of course, a little bit of swearing, but unlike Mary Shelley Frankenstein, this book has a lot more morbidity, grotesque scenery. Kiersten White, I loved it, 5-star. The next book that I picked up in the month of October is The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs. Now this is actually a series if you were unaware of it, but I did pick this up because, one, the movie is coming out with Jack Black, and I'm like, okay, this is a perfect middle grade novel that I can read with my kids and get them excited about the movie. This is about a young boy. His family dies in the very beginning, you know that right off the bat, and he goes to live with his Uncle Jonathan, who he really has never met. He's heard about, he knows he's weird, but he is forced to go live with him in this mansion, and of course, things get weird and mysterious, and there's a clock in the wall that you can hear. It ticks the entire time, never stops. And lo and behold, mystery, mayhem, and just fun and wizardry happens in this, and it was great. I rated it a G. I did only give it 3 stars though. I loved it as a kid. Like, I really liked this as a kid, but as an adult, it kind of fell flat for me, which kind of bummed me out. But pretty much just think of like R.L. Stein's Goosebump books. Pretty much the same feels. Anyways, 3 stars. The next book that I picked up in the month of October is The Never List by Kothi Zan. I hope I'm saying that right. I actually listened to this on Audible. I had a hard time with the narrator's voice, but I stuck with it because my husband and I were doing it together. And so every couple of hours at night while we were like getting ready for bed or whatever, we would just flip it on and listen for like 30 minutes or an hour. I'm rating this a 3, but the more I think about it, I might lower it to more of like a 2.5. Gosh, I don't even know how to like explain this in a way. So the plot was great. The whole idea behind this book, I ate up. But I felt like a lot of things were very vague in the story, which leaves a lot to the imagination of the reader, I guess. But at the same time, the type of book that this is, I think we needed, or I needed, as a reader, just more in-depth details and information. I also had kind of a hard time. The main character in this, she has agoraphobia, which is like, you know, she can't leave her house. Like, she's literally terrified to leave her house, to be even sociable with people. And suddenly she goes from having agoraphobia to instantaneously being like a private eye detective, like overnight. These two girls that are college friends, they have a never list, and this never list is things that they should never do. Don't ever get in a car of a stranger. Don't ever leave the house without your pepper spray. Well, anyways, one night they decide to go against one of their never lists, and they are at a party. They jump in a car that's pretty much like an Uber, and suddenly this guy's not taking them home, and the next thing they know, they end up in his cellar. 3 years later, she gets saved pretty much. And so it's like 10 years later, the man that had kidnapped them and kept them in his cellar is up for parole. So it brings up a lot of anxiousness, a lot of just past memories. So I like the premises of this book. I like the plot idea of this book, but I felt like it just fell a little bit flat for me because things were quite vague and it just didn't, some things just didn't add up. So I'm gonna actually lower this to probably a 2.5. I'm rating it R. Obviously, it doesn't go into sexual detail, but there is like BDSM, torture, bondage kind of things, lots of bad language other than that, so definitely rated R. The next book that I read in the month of October, and I guess this wouldn't be a spooky thriller, so I kind of lied, but I swear this is the last one that's not for October. So this is A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. This is book 3 in the Court of Thorns and Roses series. I've been listening to it on Audible. Freaking love the series. It is definitely a high fantasy YA, not like series, but I'm having a hard time wondering why this is considered YA when it should be kind of considered adult, especially with how much like graphic sex is in these novels. The first one, not so much, a little bit, but man, book 2 and book 3 definitely have a lot of sexual content in it, like explicit, and I'm thinking like, I don't know if this should be like YA. This is more like adult, or is it called new adult? Whatever it is, definitely X-rated for lots of schmoozy sex scenes, as well as LGBTQ references and some language. So, I loved this book. The others I gave a 5-star. I'm giving this one a 4-star just because it was more of political intrigue in this one, and it's a pretty big book, but it was seriously non-stop, just political divides, political setups, political you know what. Like, it is literally just trying to get from point A to point B through a battle. Feyre, she is still amazing and badass and humble as always. I love her character. I love Rhys. I'm still wondering if there's more to Tamlin than we're not seeing, that I'm like, there better be another book because I need to know more. I love this series. I will continue on with it. I love it. Awesome. 4 stars. The next book that I picked up in the month of October was a huge shocker for me. So this is called What You Left Behind by Samantha Hayes. This is one of my Dollar Tree haul books, and I gave it 4 stars. That's right, people, 4 stars on a Dollar Tree book. Hail yes. I did rate this rated R. There is quite a lot of language. There is some mature content, so trigger warning, there is suicide, of course, as well as LGBT references and alcohol use. So definitely rated R. Oh my God, I loved this. Okay, the premise of this book, you go in and it's pretty much this town is plagued with a bunch of teenage suicides back to back. Suddenly they stop. 18 months later, they start happening again. Now, lo and behold, there is a main character in here. She is a police detective. She goes to this town because she's actually on vacation and she's visiting her sister that is in this town. Suddenly, as these newer suicides start happening while she's there, she's thinking, I don't think these are suicides. Like, I think there's more to these. Maybe someone's behind them. I love this. You didn't know who to trust. The character development was amazing. Like, I swear every character that was in it, you really got a feel of who they were, but at the same time, you're like, can I trust this person? It was so good. And the end actually threw me for a loop that I was not expecting. So I loved this book, 4 stars. Also too, I love the fact that there was an autistic grown man in this story, and several of the chapters are from his point of view because he kind of thinks like a child, but at the same time, he's a grown man and he has morals and values, and the way he thinks and the way he sees things was just amazing. I love the fact that there was a mental disability in here and it didn't romanticize it. It is what it is. It was amazing. Samantha Hayes did such an amazing job with his character. I loved it. All right, the next book that I read in the month of October is, of course, Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. So I gave this 4 stars. I listened to it on Audible and I really loved it. Like, I soaked it up. It was good. I had to make the Audible book go at like a 1.25, 1.5 because the narrator was quite slow, which is understanding because classic books can kind of be read slower. So to kind of speed it up and make it sound like more normal, I sped it up and it worked great for me. Back in those times, Mary Shelley, she's a woman, an amazing author. I mean, the fact that she can come up with this kind of a monster back in her day, and then this monster still, hundreds of years later, is still living today in our imaginations and other books and movies, is just astounding to me. So Mary Shelley, you're the freaking bomb, girl. But it lacked what I was hoping for that was like in Kirsten White's The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, and I guess because this kind of goes along with its time. It wasn't morbid, it wasn't grotesque, it was actually quite vague, but you could rate it PG-13 because it does talk about like going into the slums and like these houses and like using body parts and animal parts, but it doesn't really go into descriptive detail like Kirsten White's book does. So things were quite vague, but you got the gist of it. So it is kind of like older, you know, like mature content that it's talking about, but at the same time it was so vague that it's like, could you consider it PG? In our day and age, I think it could be. I loved it. It was great. Don't believe anything that was in like the movies, like he's alive. Like none of that is in there. You get the story of not only from Victor Frankenstein's point of view and why he came up with this monster and then how grossed out he was by this monster and he wanted nothing to do with him, to suddenly he's forced to listen to Frankenstein, which is the actual monster himself, listen to his story from the time he becomes who he is to a year later where he's been hiding out this whole time. He's, grotesque to most people. He's nothing but a monster and he's got feelings and all of this. And so Victor has to sit and listen to this. And so you get empathy for the monster, but at the same time, the things the monster starts to do to get vengeance on Victor is just, he kind of turns into more than just a physical monster. He is more of a realistic monster in a sense. Loved it. 4 stars. I love you, Mary Shelley. You did amazing. Okay, so since I was on a classic kick all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, I really liked Frankenstein. I decided to pick up The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is actually quite a small book. This bind up, the Barnes & Noble leather-bound edition. There's multiple short stories in here. There's probably like 7 or 8 stories all in here. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, your nails are so loud on the floor. So the actual story of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is actually quite a short book. And I gave it a 2.5 star. You know, Dr. Jekyll is taking a consumption that he makes, a drug that turns him into Mr. Hyde, which makes him feel amazing and strong and just more powerful. Even though technically the way they describe Mr. Hyde in this is he's like short in stature, but he's like big. So I almost like started picturing a dwarf almost. I don't know, the way they described him is just not what I pictured, because maybe I've just read too many other books that kind of portray his character, or in movies, I don't know. But the story itself was quite vague. Even like when Mr. Hyde was murdering people or just being a complete monster and animal, the details were just very vague. So you were like, he ran over a child. That's like all you get. You're like, I need more information. So I think if Robert Louis Stevenson, I think if he had actually made this small book, short story, into a bigger book and put more grotesque details and more, I think I would have liked it more, but it is what it is. It's a classic for its time. It threw people for a loop. This was just a whole new monster that this man has made up. You know, I could see the fascination behind it, but in our day and age, it was kind of hard to really fall in love with this book because it was so vague. You didn't really get a character development either. So it felt like there was so much more to the Dr. Jekyll, and there was so much more that could have been explained from Mr. Hyde. And I just felt like it kind of meh. Definitely like PG-13 due to, you know, like, drug consumption. Technically, he is taking something that is altering him, as well as, you know, just murders and whatnot. But I guess in our day and age, maybe it could have been a PG. I don't know. So I'm going with it. Okay, so following The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I decided to start reading a few of the other small short stories in here, and so I read about 3 more. So actually I've read like halfway through this book. You can see where my marker is. The next short story is called Will O' the Mill. So I'm giving this more of like a 2.5 star, maybe a 3. It was okay. Rated G. Oh my gosh, Walter, sit down. You're so loud. Come here. Come here. Can you sit? Sit. Sit. Good boy. Okay, so it's about this young boy who is adopted by these parents. They live in an inn, and of course, being a young boy, as he grows up, he wants more. He doesn't want to be stuck in this small town. He wants to, you know, explore the world and be this whole other person. And lo and behold, as he's a teenager, a gentleman, a stranger, comes to the inn. Can you hear my dog walking? Gotta love it. A stranger comes along and persuades him to just be happy with the way life is. And he does. He accepts the fact that this is his life. He's going to be here forever. He's going to probably take over this inn as his parents, you know, grow old and die. And he's just learned to live with the fact that life is what it is and to be happy with what you've got. So it's kind of a philosophical book, I guess, in a way, about just being happy with what you've got. But sometimes even choices that you make along the way, they may not be what makes you happy, but just learn to live with what you've got. So that's why it was kind of a sad story, but at the same time it's kind of boring, so more of like a 2.5, 3 star, I guess. The next book that I read was Markheim, which I'm also giving probably a good 3 star. It was okay. It is about pretty much this man who has a lot of evil and demise in his, you know, soul. He decides to, there's my other dog on. Gotta love it. Anyways, he decides to pop into this shop and he's going to steal from this gentleman, and then of course he accidentally kills him, and so he's got that on his conscience, but at the same time he's like, why should I bother? So suddenly he's got this a pull of good and evil within him in such a small amount of time. Everything is happening in this shop, so it's very short. Be more like PG, because he does murder the man and he does kind of describe it. It was an okay book, a struggle between good and evil, between just one man in his inner self is pretty much what it was. So the next one that I did is called Thrawn Janet. Now, I tried reading Thrawn Janet, and oh my gosh, within 5 minutes I put it down, and I was thinking, there's no way I can read this. The Scottish accent that is put into these words is so hard to read and understand that I was like, okay, so I'm pretty sure this is how Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was written, but they translated it so it's not so hard to read, because literally in one sentence I couldn't even make out what it was saying because of the thick Scottish accent. Like, it would take one word and it would like split it into two with an apostrophe, and then you're like, I don't even know what that word is supposed to be now because it doesn't even make any sense. So I had this crazy idea, jump on YouTube and try to find someone who reads the book out loud. Sure enough, there's a gentleman on there. I will have to try linking it down below in my subscription bar. He has got the thickest Scottish accent, and he reads Thrawn Janet perfectly. I can totally understand it so much better than trying to read it on my own, but still with such a thick accent, I still was like, okay, what did he just say? Like, it was so, but it's like you're so enthralled with their accent that you're like, I'm just eating this up. But I got the gist of it. It is a 2-star for me. I'm giving it PG-13 because there is a demon or devil possession as well as suicide in this short book. So supposedly Thrawn Janet, her name is Janet, it's a woman, the town thinks she is a witch. They try drowning her one day. This newer preacher that is in this town sees this mob trying to drown this woman. He saves her and hires her to be his housemaid. And one day just things start to happen around the house that are a little bit weird. And one day he sees that she has hung herself from the rafters of his house, and so he's a little freaked out by that, and then suddenly she's like alive, but she's not herself. She's all twisted and weird, and so definitely possessed and is like come back to life. The way it's all described, like there is no way I would have figured out what that book was about unless I listened to the dude read it on YouTube. Like, it was really hard. So I'm giving it a 2-star because the plot was really like thoughtful, but just trying to understand it. And if the short story was maybe a little bit longer, it would have been better. But it's a classic. It is what it is. It's Scottish history pretty much in the making, and 2-star. The last book that I read in the month of October, finally we're getting to the end of this, is The Witches by Roald Dahl. Now, I watched the movie of this in the late 80s, early 90s, and it scared the shiz out of me. So when I figured out that I could pick this up and read it, and I read it for Spookathon, of course, I loved it. It was morbid. It was everything I remember the movie being, if not more. These witches that are spread out throughout the entire world, and they hate children. Children smell disgusting to them, but these witches are in disguise and they look like everyday women. So trying to figure out a regular woman and a witch is quite hard unless you know how to look for it. Lo and behold, this young boy and his grandmother are on vacation at a hotel, and there happens to be a humongous witches meeting at the same hotel. The Grand High Witch, who is in charge of all the witches and is the most powerful and most magical, decides that because they hate children so much and these witches aren't doing their job getting rid of these children as fast as she would like, she's gonna turn them all into mice. So witches turning children into mice, and it was a great story. If you've got a kid that loves reading R.L. Stine goosebump books, but maybe wants something even a little bit more morbid and weird, this is right up their alley. 4 stars, loved it. I had a great reading month in October, if you can't tell. I read a ton of books, but of course a lot of them were like middle grade novels or short stories or even short Audible books. So of course it just made for a huge reading month, but I did read some big books too. I loved my entire reading month of October, even though some of my reads may have been more of a 2.5 star, but I did have a lot of 4 and 5 star books in there as well. So I am not complaining at all. Thank you guys so much for joining me during my huge October wrap up, and I can't wait to see you guys in my next video. Bye.